be omitted stand part of the question, and I call the member for Goldstein.
Well, thank you, Speaker. In fact, and I always like to follow the member for Cowan because, if nothing else, her substance and sass always contributes to the debate in both her physical manifestation as well as her words. And I note she's laughing and enjoying everything I'm saying, but I do have a strong affection for her because, if nothing else, she contributes and makes a contribution with passion and commitment. Speaker, that this bill needs to be introduced, frankly, is embarrassing. Embarrassing because it has got to a situation where universities are not the home of free and intellectual inquiry to pursue the advancement of our nation, our collective knowledge, scientific inquiry and humanity. In fact, when I used to serve as Australia's Human Rights Commissioner before being elected to this place, I wrote an article specifically looking at higher education and some of the issues that were faced, particularly where universities refused to accept centres focused on free and intellectual inquiry. And it finished with a joke. What is the opposite of diversity? Sadly, it has become university. And that's why I say it's embarrassing. Because universities should be the pillars on which we build the intellectual foundations of our country. They should be the pillars in which young minds, thirsty and enthusiastic, are challenged and confront difficult realities, where we hold a window up to our society economically, socially, politically, environmentally, scientifically, and that matters are debated on the basis of their merit, not on the basis of their conformity to rigid ideology. And that we are now faced with a number of examples where universities have been bullied, silenced, or intimidated into silence. Should embarrass them. Where are the university councils and the university senates standing up for their core purpose? Why is it that legislation needs to be introduced to tell them to do their core job? Because this is their core job, Deputy Speaker. The kerfuffle that surrounded the establishment of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation to study the great works of our own culture and history. It is not the sole source of the font of all knowledge of our community and civilisation, and nobody is arguing it is, but that we seem to think that it's, or some people seem to think that it's acceptable to exclude them from academic inquiry because of the authors or the times, considering the incredible contribution they have made to the foundation of some of the most free and prosperous societies on earth, should embarrass universities. That the universities in Western Australia rejected funding to support a centre that focused on how we can achieve consensus around issues like the science and policy of climate change, should embarrass a university. That we have activists that want to stand up against the bullying and intimidatory behaviour of communist parties around the world, and they find themselves in a position of sanction or censure, should embarrass universities. Because that is not the basis in which free intellectual inquiry, research, activism, debate should be conducted in a free liberal democracy such as ours. The legislation we have before us today should not be needed. But here we are. The Higher Education Support Amendment Freedom of Speech Bill 2020 will strengthen protections, freedom of speech and academic freedom on university campuses and, by default, Australia. The legislation will bring the Higher Education Support Act 2003 into line with the French Model Code, which all universities have agreed to adopt this year. The legislation is a culmination of a careful process, identifying what needs to be done to support free and open debate. On the 14th of November 2018, the Minister for Education announced that the former Chief Justice of the High Court, Robert French, would review existing material regarding free speech on university campuses, which led to this process. And the report concluded at the end on 6th of April 2019. The protection of free speech, freedom of speech and academic freedom could be strengthened by the adoption of model codes embedded in higher education providers, institutional regulations or policies on a voluntary basis. Now, there were minor amendments that were suggested and adopted, and the amendments would align the language currently used around free intellectual inquiry with the proposed model code's identification of free speech and academic freedom, bringing greater clarity and consistency. Since then, we've had universities considering and looking at different models that can be adopted. And of course, it's culminated in the situation where we have legislation which enables free intellectual inquiry in university campuses. But we should never lose sight of this moment and why it matters to pass this legislation, as reluctant and frankly as embarrassing as it may be. Because in the end, free and intellectual inquiry is critical to the foundations of our society. It's actually the wellspring on so much of our society succeeds. And we should never lose sight of that. And there are so many reasons. We go through them, and you can read, if you wish, my speeches when I was Human Rights Commissioner, but plenty of other great works from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty through to discussions in the present day. But the principles remain consistent. The point of free speech is not just because it's the manifestation of people's freedom of conscience and the freedom to impart ideas, though it is. It's the opportunity to test, particularly in a university environment, bad ideas and have them exposed by the light of day. It's so that bigotry and prejudice within communities can be challenged, confronted, and we can see our common humanity. It's so that bad ideas are tested against evidence, so that our community and our society can progress. And as soon as you create a linear model of thinking, an ideological framework which constrains that debate, you set humanity and our country on a course against progress. You deny people the capacity to understand what is right and what is wrong on a path towards a made perfect humanity, where we can ensure that future generations not just carry the learned knowledge and history of our community and our civilisation and all of the bits that feed into it, but to continue their journey and contributing to it to compound the success of future generations. And when that's denied in an environment specifically to promote education, research and challenging people's thinking, as universities are, you don't just undermine education, though you do. You undermine the potential of future generations to succeed and give to their children the inheritance that we received and wish to give on to them. There are plenty of societies in human history that have constrained free and open discussion because they thought they had the perfect solution, anchored on an ideological hubris that they somehow had reached a form of perfection for themselves. And all that history showed, like democracy itself, is that it meant there were no safety valves to test that madness that undermined corroded the very foundations of their society. That's why freedom of speech goes to the core of liberalism itself. It's because it's necessary to progress society itself, the economy itself, community and culture and history and tradition itself. Because it's about the decentralisation of power from the select few to the empowerment of millions of people and for truth to be spoken to power, including in this place. And it doesn't matter what the context or the setting, we must always stand up for it and by it, not the selective representations that so many people make when people stand up for ideas that they agree with. It was misallocated to or misattributed to him, but the Voltairean principle nonetheless stays the same. And sadly, too many people in this place and outside this place, particularly those on the modern progressive left, make bold claims and commitments to free speech so long as it conforms to their world view. We have seen this before and we will see it again, and they bastardise language with concepts like fair speech, which means that people's thoughts and expressions should be anchored to their identity, or the limits in which they can express themselves are simply based on the recipient of the expression. And we know the history of free speech. When you empower censorship, you empower a censor. Centralised power to dictate what people can say, what they can express, the circumstances which they can, which suppresses the advancement of our species. Because that's what free speech is about. It is not just about the expression of ideas, it is about power. Censorship is about the centralisation of power at the expense of the individual and in favour of the privileged few. Free speech is about the empowerment of the many, for diversity, for debate, and for the individual. And no society has ever succeeded where it has sought to empower the few to dictate over the many. The only sustainable societies that exist today that continue to compound and grow and contribute not just to themselves but to those beyond their borders are those that empower individuals, families, communities as the foundation for the success of their country and their civilisation. So this legislation may be targeted and specific only to issues related to higher education, but the reverberation and the ripples from which it sets extends far greater to the advancement of our society, and we should never lose sight of that. Today is one of those moments where you have legislation before you which can not just have an immediate effect but continue to contribute to the advancement of us, a people, through the empowerment of individuals in their contribution to the progress of humanity. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.